Awesome. Alrighty, it is 9, so we'll go ahead and get started. A couple things as we get going here. Actually, let me go ahead and get the captions on for the people who are zooming in today. There we go. All right, there we go. That should minimize cutting into things. So this Friday, this coming Friday, will be our first review day. The review days are always also going to be like catch-up days. So like obviously we're starting this lecture a whole day late, so we'll probably be finishing that. And then we'll always do a review activity. In the past, I've used Jeopardy as a way to review. And then a week from today is when you will have your first exam distributed. So to get that exam, you will have to come to class because it's going to be paper. And then you can stay in class to start working on it and ask me questions. Or if you work better going someplace else, we can do that too. So that's coming up in a week. Alrighty, I'm gonna go ahead and take attendance. Again, my brain's just not all the way there yet. Thank you for your patience with me. Alrighty, Mia and Deja. All right, Nora. Okay. I think you sit over there, but you always sit right there. All right, Abby. Sarah, Ellis. There you are. Miriam. Lauren. Kaya, Lyric, Onyx, India, Daria, Heaven, all right, Alex, Sarah P, Sequoia, and Grace. Okie dokie. So today we're going to start talking about motivation and emotion. This is sort of like a weird thing to squish together, but pretty much all intro-psych books do it. And remind me of your name? Okay, perfect. And I think it's because they are very related, and certainly emotion can be a type of motivator, right? But you could certainly cover each of these not only in a chapter, but honestly a whole class. And in fact, we do have a whole class here at Wesleyan on theories of motivation. We don't have one about emotion, but it's certainly covered in pretty much every other class that we teach as well. So we'll be talking about these, and it's sort of why we do the things we do, essentially. And we're going to talk about some key concepts, and then we'll use some key examples to try to illustrate them. So we'll start with what is motivation? Well, motivation can take many forms, but all involve mental processes that select and direct our behavior. So it tells us this is what we should do and why, essentially. So psychologists use the concept of motivation in a whole host of different ways. One is that we try to connect what we can see, the observable behavior we see people do, and honestly, even like animals do, to what's going on inside, to the internal states. We try to account for variability in behavior. right? So not every person acts the same. Why is that? And not even every person acts the same in a given situation, right? Some of you are writing notes right now, some of you are typing notes. Some people prefer to be using the PowerPoint on their computer, right? All host of various things. And motivation could kind of help us explain why y'all differ in those behaviors. And it's likely related to what's worked for you in the past, right? It also can explain why people persevere in the face of adversity, right? So we just had 9/11 yesterday. You know, why did people walk down 78 flights of stairs, right? Why did people keep searching through the rubble when there was sort of no hope? Why did we, after taking forever to decide what we were going to put there, you know, persevere in putting up a memorial and a museum and a giant new building, right? Or it can talk about things like, why are we persevering despite COVID just being exhausting, right? Like, I'm sure you all have days where you're like, is it worth getting out of bed, right? But we get out of bed, right? So that's what keeps us going, motivation. It also relates biology to behavior. So one of the things we're going to talk about is how biological drives, which we'll define next, relate to our motivations. So there are certain things that our bodies just need, right? And so those are going to play into our motivation and what behaviors we do as a result. So a drive is biologically instigated motivation, biologically related, biologically rooted motivation. Things like hunger, thirst, the need for sleep. Those are all drives. They're things that our bodies biologically need. Motive is an internal mechanism that directs behavior. So motive is an internal mechanism that directs behavior. And motives are typically used to describe motivations that we learn instead of them being these biologically based drives. So there are things that we strive for that don't have a biological basis, right? I know we have a lot of athletes in this room, right? You are really motivated, you have motives to win games, right? But there's nothing biologically related about that. Every single person in this room has a motive to get yourselves through college, right? That's not anything that's biologically driven. And yet it's something that every single person here is doing it. So as you can guess, there are a whole bunch of different types of motivation. And I have some little sarcastic demotivational posters throughout this PowerPoint. So, you know, take those as you will. But a couple different things here. So intrinsic motivation is the desire to engage in an activity for its own sake. You're doing that activity to do that activity. I'm just gonna put down on some of the glare here. So you are doing it for its own sake. It's intrinsic, it's coming from inside of you. Extrinsic motivation is the desire to engage in an activity to get an external consequence. In most cases, a reward. So a desire to engage in an activity to achieve an external consequence, a reward. So might be motivated to win that game because it feels really good to win, right? Or your coach said, if we win today, I'm going to take everybody out for dinner. Things along those lines. If you're a higher level athlete, it might be winning that Olympic gold medal, right? Things along those lines. It might be money in a lot of cases, right? We do people that hate their 9-to-5 jobs, and not everyone does, obviously, but like they're going with extrinsic motivation. Okay, I need money to pay my bills, right? And then conscious motivation is having the desire to engage in an activity and being aware of that desire. I want to do this. So having the desire to engage in activity and being aware of it. Unconscious motivation is having a desire to engage in the activity, but being consciously unaware of that desire. So somewhere in your mind, there is a desire to do it, but you're not consciously like, I'm gonna go do this. I wanna go do this, right? But you do it anyway, and you might not be aware of what your motivation is. And these can interact to where you can have intrinsic conscious motivation, extrinsic conscious motivation, intrinsic unconscious motivation, extrinsic unconscious motivation. So for example, horrible situation, you might be unconsciously extrinsically motivated if you know if you don't do something, you will be physically abused by someone in your life, right? And you might not even realize that's why I'm doing it. Alrighty, so just like we used food as our example for research methods, because everyone can relate, we're going to use hunger as one of our examples for the same reason. So this is the multiple systems approach to hunger. This looks at all aspects of hunger motivation and eating behaviors. So again, we could just say, well, this is a drive, right? It's biological, and be done with it. But we know for humans, it's much more complex than that, right? So our biological factors include things like brain mechanisms that control hunger. So there are multiple mechanisms within our brains, like energy requirements, nutritional state, food preferences, food cues in the environment, and cultural demands, right? We get all those in our mind and they become part of why we do what we do. The central role here, and I don't remember, I don't have it in there, so I'll write it up for you guys. The central part of the brain is the hypothalamus. Okay. And then the other part of the brain that's really related here is the brainstem. So the hypothalamus does a lot of relation of, hypothalamus kind of like integrates a lot of things in the body, basically things that are biological with things that are emotional. The brainstem is the part of our brain that's like right here at the base of our brains. It is the most primitive part of our brain. It is the part of our brain that controls not only things like hunger, but also respiration, breathing. When someone dies of overdose of alcohol, what we usually call alcohol poisoning, what happens is they've consumed so much alcohol, and alcohol is a depressant. That means it slows everything down. When you die of alcohol poisoning, you've consumed so much alcohol that it depresses or slows down your brainstem. And so your brainstem stops telling your body to breathe and stops telling your heart to beat.
So you quite literally have to go.
Exactly. Basically, yeah. 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 So, if anyone in here hasn't turned 21, highly recommend against the 21 shots in an hour. It's unfortunately a really good way to die. Go out, celebrate, but do it in a responsible way that your body can process. We actually had someone, I think the year after I graduated undergrad, this was in Ohio, who got really drunk, was walking home and just like passed out in a snowdrift and passed away. So, less likely to happen here with the snowdrift, but just like don't put yourself in that situation. Have fun, but don't give yourself alcohol poisoning. Yeah, don't give yourself alcohol poisoning. All right, set point mechanisms. This is something that often surprises people when I talk about it. This is the idea that everyone has a weight that is your set point. And if your fat cells fall below that, then there's all kinds of signals in your body that will trigger hunger and eating behavior. So essentially, this is why a lot of people end up doing what we call yo-yo dieting, where they'll be a weight and they keep trying to get under it. And then it's like their body keeps pulling them back up to that weight, pulling them back up to that weight. We have a set point, and it might not be within like what's perceptually deemed the ideal weight for each person, right? So, this is why people really struggle to keep themselves at an unnaturally low weight. In obesity, there may be issues where you sort of reset your set point, if that makes sense. And obesity is severe overweight. And it is something that each of us has. And again, is not really talked about that much. We also have sensors in our stomach. There are pressure detectors that sense fullness or emptiness, and then they send information to the brain that basically says, hey, cut it off or send us some more. The only problem with this is it does take about 20 minutes for these to tell the brain, like, we're full. And so this is why people will overeat sometimes, because if you eat quickly, those sensors don't have a chance to catch up, basically. And so we used to jokingly call, like, after you eat a whole Chipotle burrito, that was a burrito belly, a burrito baby, right? That's because you've scarfed it down before your sensors can get there. There are also reward system preferences. We sort of evolutionarily have a preference for sweet and fatty foods. And there are reasons for this. So early humans, early hominids, both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, were very reliant on specific food sources to keep their energy going. And so they needed carbs, right? And then they also needed fatty meats. And in fact, they would try to go off, we're thinking like Ice Age, right? They would go off and like the whole group, clan, tribe, whatever, might go and kill a mammoth together so they could preserve the meat to get them through the winter. But there's an evolutionary reason why we crave those things, and also just they're really tasty too, right? So that helps. So these were those calorie-dense food that allowed our ancestors to survive when food was unpredictable, and now they're just yummy, right? You're gonna usually choose cookout over a Panera salad, particularly if you're stressed out, right? Right, and then exercise. If you engage in what's called extreme exercise, you're pushing your body towards past your limits. And again, sometimes athletes are doing this. Folks in the military obviously do this, particularly if they're special forces. That promotes hunger. So I remember watching a little behind the scenes clip of Chris Hemsworth when he was training for Thor: Love and Thunder. And he was just constantly eating because he was constantly working out, right? And then, if you engage in moderate exercise, what probably most people do when they go to the gym or go running, that actually can suppress appetite. So how much exercise you're doing or not can also affect your hunger motivation. There are also, not surprisingly, since this is a psychology class, there are also psychological factors. So one is your emotional state. When we're afraid, we usually don't eat. And for modern humans, that usually translates to when we're anxious, we don't eat as much typically. So the example I give is, as I sort of told you all in brief, when you get your PhD in clinical psychology, your last year has to be an APA accredited internship. And you have to apply and interview, and then you submit a ranking of all the places you interviewed, and they submit a ranking of all the people they interviewed. And then I jokingly call it the giant computer in the sky, just matches you. And if you don't match, you usually have to wait a whole another year, basically, to reapply. So it's very anxiety provoking because your life is on hold, right? The week before match, I couldn't really eat. I was just so anxious, right? And then as soon as I found out I matched, and I could eat, which is great, except I pushed it too much right away. We've got to be careful with our bodies. Other things that can affect how we eat: depression, stress. And again, this will differ for some people. if you look at the diagnostic criteria for depression, it talks about either overeating or a loss of appetite. So it can go both ways for folks. So a lot of people, when they're feeling just like a little stressed out or like, you know, maybe stressed about specific things like relationships, right? That might be when we go out and we get the Ben and Jerry's, right? But again, when we get to the point where it's like severely anxious, we might not be able to eat at all. Another thing that affects our hunger motivation is learning. So we associate certain situations with eating. This is why we want to eat at meal times. And actually, this is one of the reasons why when we treat people who have any kind of disordered relationship with their eating, one of the things we get them to do is schedule their eating so that their body relearns this. So we tell them to eat like 3 meals, 3 snacks a day, don't go longer than 3 or 4 hours without eating. And that just retrains your body to be on this regular schedule. This is also why when you walk into the movies, you really want popcorn. Well, partially also because they pump out the popcorn smell, right? But it's just like we've associated that. And this is also why you eat more at family holidays like Thanksgiving than you normally would at the same type of meal, right? Because we've sort of learned this is a socially acceptable time to sort of group binge eat, right? And then culture. We really react to cultural messages about food, but also about body shape and size, right? So we tend to think in terms of sort of Western cultural ideal, which varies drastically depending on time frame. When I was in middle school, it was heroin chic. It was Kate Moss, basically like a hanger for the clothes. Now it's sort of the Kardashians, right? So it's still slim, but now it's like curvy slim, right? One of the best descriptors I've ever heard of our culture, and to this day, I cannot find the attribution for it, so I hope I do sometime so I can give this person credit, is that the American culture in particular is a fast food restaurant next to a bikini store, right? So we get really conflicting messages about eat all the things, but also get that bikini body.
It's like eat all the bad, all the good stuff, but also be a size zero.
Exactly.
Skinny.
Which is just not realistic for the vast majority of people. There are some people who can do that. Their metabolism just works that way, right? Right. And some of the rest of us are like, But you know, in truth, the way to get a bikini body is to put a bikini on your body, right? The way to get a swimsuit body is to put a swimsuit on your body, but that's not what our culture has told us. And again, this is going to vary drastically, not only from country to country, but also within countries, right? So certain subcultures, even within the United States, might emphasize a more curvaceous figure, for example. And so this is actually the majority of what my own research has focused on is pressures to look thin. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and show you some studies and sort of pop culture things that really sort of hit this home. So many theorists believe, and actually a lot of the data shows, that current Western standards of female attractiveness have contributed to the rise of eating disorders. One of my favorite studies, it's a really heartbreaking study, is they did a longitudinal study when American TV was first introduced to Fiji. If you're not familiar with Fiji, it's an island nation in the Pacific. They actually used to really emphasize rotund, not even curvaceous, but rotund bodies. And over, the first 5 years or so, where Western media was introduced, we saw a shift where girls wanted to be thinner, and we actually saw eating disorders for the first time ever. So we know that media is really a contributing factor. And standards have changed throughout history toward a thinner ideal. And again, this fluctuates depending on what decade we're in and what's sort of trendy at that time. So Miss America contestants declined in weight, and the winners declined by even more. And then Playboy centerfolds, interestingly, this was in the 90s, this research, I think, had lower average weight, bust, and hip measurements than in the past. And this is that data. Where you can see this is in the 80s, but they extended it in the 90s and found similar trends. Yeah, here's the one from the 90s. So it was like a little higher, but still sort of not exactly. This is the percent of their expected weight for their height. So they're all under the expected weight for their height. This is so popular that people make memes about it, right? One of my friends that I showed this to loved that it's like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed cat on the cover, right? That yeah, there's often sort of a homogenous ideal out there. And we try to say like, oh, we can celebrate body diversity, but often body diversity is still slim for women in particular, but for men, it's like a lean, muscular ideal that sometimes could be even more difficult to achieve. So these are just some of the factoids. The average model is about 5'9" and weighs 110 pounds. The BMI or body mass index is a ratio of height to weight. It's actually a really bad measure for a whole host of reasons. One is it doesn't take things like muscle into account, and we know muscle weighs more than fat, for example. So a lot of athletes come up overweight or obese, even though they're the most fit people because they have more muscle. The other problem with BMI is that it was developed to measure group rather than individual patterns by a statistician who was also a eugenicist. So if you're not familiar with eugenics, this is essentially like creating a pure race, which is often a white race.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I think it factors in race.
Yeah.
Like just for beings, any race other than white is gonna have a higher BMI.
Exactly, because different people's bodies culturally are going to be different shape sizes. Yeah, and even something like bone density, which we know is heavier in certain like genetic lineages, is going to make you heavier, right? Yeah. Really great book about this, if anyone's really interested in it, called Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, who's a sociologist, and gets into a lot of detail about the history of bodies of color in general, but particularly Black bodies in particular being villainized and white bodies being held up as different and idealized. And that, unfortunately, going into a lot of things like health decisions about whether or not you get life insurance. My other favorite factoid is that in the 90s, the CDC decided one day that the cutoffs they were using that were scientifically based just were too hard to remember. So they used to be 29 point something was the high range of BMI for like normal healthy. I'm just gonna put it in quotes because like your weight doesn't actually determine your health, if that makes sense. And they moved it down to 25. So one day in the 90s, a bunch of people who had been healthy weight woke up overweight. So it's really arbitrary and problematic, but people still use it as a marker, as a point of comparison. The average woman is 5'4", 142 pounds, 24.3 BMI. And I have to say, I looked for this picture for a really long time when I first made these slides in like 2010-ish. It's really hard to find a picture of a woman who's just like average height and weight, right? We don't see that often. We know that we get all kinds of pressures from the media. We have, there's all kinds of studies about Barbie. I've actually got one published where we had little 5 to 8-year-old girls play with Barbie, and they said, they wanted to be thin like her. And then we actually did one where we had them play with a full figure doll, and they actually said they'd rather look like her. So it just shows you how influential anything a kid sees is. And then we've had sort of this like appropriation of body positivity that started with the Dove ads. The idea was like, we're going to accept all bodies. But if you look at the taglines, it's like curvy thighs, bigger bums, rounder stomachs. What better way to test our firming range, our firming cream? It's like you're allowed to have this body, but we're still going to make you try to control it, right?
It's like you're allowed to look like but also buy this thing that's.
Exactly. So again, let me go ahead and share sound because I do have a video clip that hopefully the link will work here. It's
Switch and save $652. It's okay. There's enough for everyone.
Some of you might have seen this before, and this one is less about weight and more about all the things they do to an image before we ever see it. Just how unrealistic it is.
Grade 5, please. Camera's rolling. And we're recording sound. Slated. Sounds great.
To aren't even real, like the models don't even look like that, right? Which is, yeah, which part of that surprised you the most? I always love hearing people's reactions.
And they stretch the neck.
Yeah. The neck, and to me, the eyes, they make the eyes much bigger. It's almost like the Disney or the anime thing, right? It's really interesting to think about. Yeah. So that's any image we see pretty much is getting at least some of, not all of that done before we see it. And it's even more problematic for women of color and people of color. There are images where Beyonce has been essentially whitewashed by Photoshop. Her skin tone is much lighter. And then again, as I mentioned, Barbie is problematic. And we know some of these stats about real women. Barbie would be like Shaquille O'Neal height, but only weigh 101 pounds. Not good. She would wear a size 4. I think it would be a size 4 mostly to accommodate her bust, which would be a double F. And her waist would be 19 inches, which is the same circumference as her head. Her hips would be 33 inches and her shoe size would be a 5. So again, imagine someone that can't even reach that height. Shaquille O'Neal's height with a women's size 5 shoe. She wouldn't be able to walk upright. She'd have to crawl on all 4s because she'd be too top heavy. Her body would only have room for half a liver and a few inches of intestines, as opposed to the usual 26 feet. So the result would be death from malabsorption. The stretch neck we just saw in the Photoshop, Barbie's neck is actually twice as long as the average human's, which would make it more difficult to hold up her head. To look like a Barbie, proportionally a healthy woman would need to add 61 centimeters to her height, subtract 15 centimeters from her waist, and add 13 centimeters to her chest and 8 to her neck length. If a woman did have the same measurements as Barbie, she wouldn't have enough body fat to menstruate, and therefore she could not reproduce. And Barbie has like acknowledged this and tried to introduce more varied Barbies, but now they've kind of like gone back to the normal one. Yeah, they didn't vary that much. They didn't make like petite and tall Barbie and curvy Barbie, but curvy Barbie was like maybe a size 12 and the average woman's like a size 16, I think. So again, if any of you played with Barbies like I did as a kid, does this mean you're ruined for life? No, it just means that from a pretty young age, Barbie is 3 and up. We're giving kids a pretty unrealistic idea of what you should look like, right? And we think that this really is a phenomenon of Western culture. And this is one of my favorite studies that looks at this. So this looked at people who are part of the Old Order Amish. So if you're not familiar with who those folks are, they are people with strong religious convictions who dress plainly, don't use electricity, tend to farm the land, make things by hand. And they live in places like Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, but they're not like exposed to the same media we are. And so this kind of shows it's not geographic, right? What they found is young men and young women showed no body dissatisfaction. And they were very accurate in their perceptions of their own bodies, whereas if we did it with folks in this room, we tend to overestimate our body shape and size a lot of the times. And exposure to media images of the thin ideal seems to create to this normative body dissatisfaction. As I mentioned, guys are unfortunately not exempt. So there is a disorder that's classified in the DSM as body dysmorphic disorder with muscle dysmorphia. You don't have to know that really long term. But it's given a lot of sort of nicknames like bigorexia, muscle dysmorphic disorder, reverse anorexia. And so this is where, as with this image, a guy could be really buff, but he looks in the mirror and he sees himself as scrawny. And so these folks will start to use steroids. There's like a whole stepping stone theory where they might just start out pretty normal, use some protein powder. Then you're maybe just using some creatine, right? And then you move up and you're using and abusing anabolic steroids, which have a lot of risk. Not everybody, but some people will have things like heart issues. And there are anecdotal stories of kids being given steroids by their coaches as young as 5th grade. Yeah.
So would that kind of like progression be similar in the way that it affects psychologically, like druggage?
Oh yeah, yep. And it's the gateway hypothesis or the stepping stone hypothesis is based off drug use. Yeah, exactly. And some of the drugs themselves have addictive properties if you feel good when you take them. And the problem with even the lower level supplements, right? Even if you're taking something like creatine or ephedrine, is like they're supplements, and supplements don't have to be regulated by the FDA in the same way something that's actually classified as a medication is. So this is why when I was in high school in the late 90s, there were these horror stories of kids who were taking like ephedra, high school athletes, and like dying of heart attacks. Terrifying, right? These folks tend to do excessive exercise or weightlifting, devoting entire days to it. And they have mirror dissatisfaction. They will check their bodies in the mirror 12 times or more a day. They will engage in very strict diets and compare their physiques with those of other men. And we see this with toys as well. So these are the original Star Wars action figures from the late 70s, early 80s, when Star Wars first began. And then when they re-released the movies in the late 90s, these are the action figures they came up with. And Mark Hamill, who plays Luke Skywalker, was like, somebody gave my action figure steroids. He was like, I've never looked like that. G.I. Joe might be even more egregious. Like when he started out, he really was sort of just like your average Joe. And now you've got, whatever that is, bodybuilder person. Right, so kids are getting this as a young age either way. And that's going to motivate you to affect how or whether you eat, right? And certain groups are at even greater risk for these pressures. So we know that models, actors, dancers, athletes. So of college athletes surveyed, 9% met full criteria for an eating disorder. Another 50% had symptoms of disordered eating. And these can include things like binging and purging, fasting for periods of time, things along those lines. Gymnasts in particular, and this is an old statistic, my impression is this is starting to change, but it used to be about 20% of folks who were gymnasts met criteria for an eating disorder. Certainly there still are gymnasts with eating disorder, but now the physique is more athletic. And so we don't see this quite as much. There was actually a book that came out in the like 90s, I think, maybe early 2000s, called Little Girls in Pretty Boxes, that was about this phenomenon. And I should give you context that like the numbers that are reported for not these groups is like 1 to 2% of people, right? So this is multiple times more. In professional ballerinas, professional ballet dancers, the rate is 20 times higher of eating disorders. One of the horror stories I remember reading about was there was an elite ballet school. So sometimes when you are training to be a professional ballerina, you'll go and like essentially live at a boarding school to mostly do ballet. And one of those had to get all their plumbing replaced because the acid from all of the girls purging had actually eaten away at the pipes. Yeah. Again, depending on the study, you're going to see a big range of eating problems, 7, 38, 15%. And this is actually when I was in college, I did a project about this. And so I found some archival pictures of these women. And so this was a famous Russian ballerina who came over to the US. The thing that gets me here is it actually looks like her ballet or point shoe is too wide for her foot, which is like dangerous on top of everything else. And then this is actually a picture of a ballerina from the early 2000s. You can see every rib, right? And so this is still an aesthetic. We also know not only with toys, but just in general that these start young. This is one of my favorite studies that I've read about. So this was actually Mernon and Smolak were two of my undergrad professors, and Mills and Good were two of their students. And they showed pictures to elementary school kiddos. And at that time, it was like Britney Spears, Jennifer Lopez, people like that were in fashion. And they said, what would you have to do to look like this? And the boys, I think they showed them models, because at that point, there weren't really. It's so interesting because we did a follow-up like a year or two later. And by that time, we could find like pictures of male celebrities with their physique showing. But it wasn't the case, just a few years prior. So that's a confounding factor. But the boys were really jokey. They're like, oh, you'd have to lift a house. And the girls, these were 1st through 5th grade girls, said, you'd have to not eat, or you'd have to eat and throw up. So like being that young, they still recognize like, if I want to look like this ideal, I'd have to engage in disordered eating behaviors. The really cool thing is that Andy Mills and a couple other students that he collaborated with actually wrote a kid's book in response to this. It's called Shapesville. It's actually incorporated into some empirically supported prevention programs for disordered eating today. We have a copy. My daughter loves it. It's just really cute. It's about how like different shapes have different bodies, so they do different things and they like different things, but it gets the message through. And so we've been referencing eating disorders, so I'll tell you a little bit more about them. So they're one of the most common problems among young females in any Western country. And as I said, the prevalence rate isn't that high. And this statistic is an older statistic that said about 90% of patients are women. What we're seeing now is it's like maybe a quarter or more of patients are actually men. So what happened? A couple things. One is we adjusted some of the criteria for the disorders to be more scientifically accurate, and that sort of brought more men into the fold. Another is that exactly. Yeah, it's still hard for anyone to seek help, particularly men, but it's getting more socially acceptable. Yeah. But you still have people who say things like, well, you're a guy, you can't have an eating disorder. It's really very frustrating. When we do studies where we have questionnaires or interviews, we see much higher rates. And it could be a couple things. One is these numbers up here are usually reported from the people who actually seek help. And as I just mentioned, not everybody seeks help, even girls or women. Eating disorders are often things people are really good at hiding. Another reason is that for these populations, you know, it's often like self-selection, whether you're going to participate or not. And it might be the case that people who have eating disorders are more interested in participating in studies about them. We do know that about a third of adolescent females use some extreme form of weight control, like throwing up, using diet pills, things along those lines. Diet pills, also supplements, also not regulated. Some of them are especially meth, essentially meth. They just are stimulants. And so you hear those ads like, more weight loss, faster weight loss, energy to burn. It's because you're taking meth. For college women, up to 61% engage in some sort of disturbed eating behaviors. Again, this wouldn't necessarily be full criteria for an eating disorder, but things like extreme fasting, diet pills, throwing up, things along those lines. And then more than 80% of college women experience body dissatisfaction. And there's an old survey that said that 99% of women surveyed would like to change something about their appearance. I think for guys, it was 92%, so they're not really that far behind, right? And then these are some of the statistics I found when I was doing studies at my grad school, Penn State. So I found about, you know, a quarter to a third of the population I looked at met criteria for an eating disorder. But there's a questionnaire I gave that actually asked people about the symptoms. And again, I think that there's a couple confounding factors. One is a lot of people take psych courses because they want to find out what's going on with them. That tends to be our population. We also, so our building was on a hill and we parked at the bottom of the hill. Really great when you were running late for meetings, good cardio. But at the bottom of the hill next to our parking lot was the fashion school. So it was fashion design and fashion merchandising. And a lot of those folks would end up taking psych as an elective or diversification. And we saw really high rates of eating disorders among those folks because they were steeped in the fashion culture. And so some of the same stuff repeated there. All right, I'm going to talk briefly about the actual criteria for these disorders. And so some of these are sort of changed now. Anorexia used to be, it was like refusal to maintain 85% of your ideal weight. Now the wording is more vague. It's just basically like being underweight or not adequately taking in nutrients to get to your proper weight. For adolescents, it can also be not meeting expected thresholds as you develop, right? A fear of gaining weight or a refusal to eat. I mean, working with clients with these disorders and trying to ask them like, you know, what are you afraid will happen if you eat? And they're like, well, I'll just balloon up, right? And just, what would be the worst part about that? And unfortunately, sometimes the thoughts they have, given the culture we've just been talking about, are rational, right? We know that fat phobia is a thing. We know that weight stigma is a thing. We know that has implications not only for teasing as a kid, but also we know that people who are overweight are less likely to be hired, promoted, things along those lines. They make lower salaries. So even though we want to tell our clients, no, you know, like unfortunately, given our culture, some of this fear is realistic, not to the idea they have it. They have cognitive distortions, again, similar to what we just talked about with the guys, where they might be underweight, but they see themselves as overweight. Portia de Rossi, who is an actress and married to Ellen DeGeneres, she had a severe eating disorder at one point and weighed, I want to say less than 90 pounds. Yeah, really, really bad. Like her doctors thought she had lupus because she had so many physical symptoms when they first tested her, but it was just I don't want to say just, but it was a consequence of her eating disorder. And like she would look in the mirror and thought she still had like fat at that point in time. Like it's not physically possible to have fat at that point in time because your body essentially consumes all your fat first when you're not eating, and then it will actually start to consume things like your muscle and actually your brain. So there are studies showing, brain scan studies showing that people will actually lose brain matter. But the good thing is when you recover, it comes back. So that's good. but obviously not great. Old symptom was you had to have an absence of 3 menstrual cycles. They took that one out for a couple reasons. A, would allow men to be diagnosed. B, so many women are on birth control now that we don't see this in the same way we did, because birth control will give you a period that's not really a period. And we see people that either restrict or do some binging and purging. All right, we will pick up with the medical problems related to anorexia on Wednesday.